So, in this time period and in this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about life in the Twin Territories as they were known. And what I want you to understand is that while you have Twin Territories, there is always the intention of going towards statehood. There is no real thought towards a permanent existence of twin territories. There is no real thought towards having territorial status for the rest of um, the existence of this area, especially because this is right in the middle of um, the the country, right? So there's always the plan that at some point this is going to become a state. The debate is which half of the territory, which side of it, is it going to be Oklahoma territory or is it Indian territory? Which side of it is going to really take over and have the political influence? Which side of it is going to be um, uh, which side of it is going to have the advantage and the leadership here. And you know the there is a lot of tension between the two sides, and a part of that is the reason why there is no common unified government between the two territories. um, you know there's still a lot of tension between the white and native populations. Um, Indian Territory is still a safe place for Black communities. There are very few Black towns in Oklahoma Territory. Um, to be a Black person in the midst of these racial tensions, it's difficult as well. And so these are questions and issues that you need to keep in mind as we proceed forward. And one of the things that I want you to be mindful of is that in Indian Territory life is much more developed and better established. So, for example, when we talk about the political setup here, remember that we are um, talking about constitutions that have already been written. We have bicameral legislatures. We have elected executives. We have functioning courts. We have formal political parties, except in the Seminole tribe. They have tribal independence up until Oklahoma statehood. The parties are not like Democratic Republican parties. The parties here are rooted in old pre-removal divisions. The tribal elections here had few voters, and those who voted usually only chose the sons of Indian officials. So these were people who um, the people who voted were those who clearly had, deeply rooted um, history in the tribe. Most of the population were non-Indians, so tribal courts had no real jurisdiction. Remember, this was established um, during the Reconstruction treaties, right? When the United States, when the federal government basically said that federal courts were going to make a presence here, and tribal courts would have no jurisdiction over non-native citizens. Well, what ends up happening in Indian Territory, you have the increase of non-native citizens, and because of that, you have so many non-native citizens arriving that no matter what they did, tribal courts couldn't really do anything there, right? And with that, the laws there meant very little to 70 to 90% of the population. who weren't tribal citizens. You also have the development of municipal government. And, when we talk about this development of municipal government, these uh, this development would mean that these new residents who were non-tribal citizens would split into their own party affiliations, right? They themselves would split into Democrats and Republicans, and they were authorized to do so once tribal agreements went into effect. So um, because there was no state uh, in existence, right? There's no state, and therefore no state government and no state offices. You would have to establish city offices, and they could then run for city office, and that's where you get municipal government. Um, when you have this sort of these city positions available, um, there is this belief that your political position, um, even if it's temporary, you well, let me go back for a second and set this up a little bit better. Your tribal independence is in question here, right? A lot of members of the tribe knew what was coming. They knew that um, their tribal governments were, while they would still be there, their sovereignty um, wasn't going to last very long. And because of that, they wanted to find ways to still have positions of leadership. And so, even if it was just a city position, they were going to run for those city positions. They were going to run for these leadership positions, even in these smaller roles, because eventually they knew that there would be a territorial position. Eventually they knew that there would be a state position, and eventually they knew that there would be a national position. And so what ends up happening is these city positions, these municipal offices, would become really um, really competitive, right? And these um, the when we talk about the competition for these offices, you would have multiple people running for office um, for jobs that were really loyal, than that right now, in present day, nobody would even pay attention to. But back then, because they were the only offices available, um, they would become really, really intense. Um, the devotion to the parties um, would actually be a result of the Civil War. Indian Territory actually attracted more Democrats than Republicans. Um, you had a lot of people coming to Indian Territory from the former Confederacy, coming in from the South. A lot of that is a result of the fact that after the Civil War, remember we talked about this. After the Civil War, there had been refugees from the former Confederacy who had settled in Indian Territory, and they had all identified with, all had settled in Indian Territory and moved into Indian Territory by and large. And so, because they had settled there and made their lives there with the Southeastern tribes, what they ended up doing is you know, s- they had become and stayed loyal to the Democratic Party. This is going to be very important because remember, in the 1880s and in the 1890s, the Democratic Party is going to have some very strict party ideologies, especially along the issues of race. And that's going to be important for you to remember. When it comes to the issue of race, the Democrats of the 1880s and the 1890s feel very strongly about race and about the issues of where Black Americans in particular belong in American society, right? And so in Indian Territory, Democrats dominate municipal offices. This is going to be really problematic for those people in at the federal level when we get to the time of statehood. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So let's compare that to life in Oklahoma Territory because uh, in Oklahoma Territory, when we talk about life in Oklahoma Territory and how things start to look after the land runs, um, when we look at the quality of life after land runs, their first homes there are usually made of what's known as soddies, Soddies. It's basically sod, thick blocks of grass and dirt. Um, the thing is that the land runs were usually too late in the year to plant most crops. And so these people are dealing with an extreme amount of struggle because the first few years that they lived in Indian Territory or Oklahoma Territory, I should say, they were dealing with drought. So here they were, many of them living in this so-called promised land, and all of these promises were unfulfilled. Um, and so then the question was, well, how are we going to get by? How do you make a living in a place where you were supposed to live off the land? Um, well, one of the, you know, especially when the land wasn't working out well. Well, the main crop turned out to be turnips. You could plant turnips late in the year and still harvest them before winter. They were living off of turnips themselves. The animals were fed turnips. This is going to be the go to plant even during the Great Depression, particularly when the Dust Bowl takes place. Turnips can last through anything. The other thing that these people start to make money off of was off of bleached buffalo bones. Um, you would sell bleached buffalo bones for fertilizer and dried buffalo dung for fuel and try to get by off of that. But even with turnips and buffalo bones and buffalo dung, you're not making a whole lot of money. You are barely surviving. And so when it comes to um, trying to get by in this new life of Oklahoma Territory, it becomes really important to seek out um, a reason to a higher reason or a greater reason to get by, and that's where the churches become incredibly important. Churches take on a greater role of spiritual responsibility. Churches actually serve as a sort of ethnic glue that held immigrant populations together. One of the things that starts to happen is remember, there are large immigrant populations that show up as a result of things like, you know, the coal mining industry as well as other mining industries. But there's also large immigrant populations who show up as a result of the land runs and the land lotteries, usually because of the land runs. The churches will come together and be established because of, or as a source of, um, commonality, right? They become a place where it's not only a source of worship, but a place where it's a place of community gathering. Ministers would live among the people. They served the people. They elevated the moral tone of their communities. These churches would also sponsor schools. They established colleges. So think of the roles of missionaries among native communities and native populations. That's essentially what the churches would do with Oklahoma Territory. Um, and this is incredibly important because immigrants are coming to the country in really large numbers, right? I mean, when we talk about um, how much how many people here and how much land, let me get into detail and statistics here. So, the unassigned lands on their own, we are talking about 1.9 million acres of land. I mean, to get really specific, it's 1,887,796.47 acres of land. Um, then among that, you have all of these thousands and thousands of people who show up. And that's just in the unassigned lands. Remember from the previous lecture, all of those lands throughout Oklahoma and Indian territories were opened up at some point over the course of the 1890s and then well into 1906, right? Um, your American history textbook will talk about, in whatever chapter it addresses the Gilded Age, it'll talk about all of these immigrants who show up beginning in the 1880s, show up from Southern and Eastern European countries. But from 1877 to 1890, more than 6.3 million people come into the United States. And for the most part, they live in separate communities and live according to their ethnic identities, right? I mean, you have um, Irish communities, Italian communities, Polish communities, and this happens in Chicago, in Boston, in New York, and it happens here in Oklahoma as well. In Oklahoma, um, in 1891 in the Sac and Fox Reservation, you have the a Czech immigrant population that participates in the land run. That and the Czech immigrant population actually came from um, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Wisconsin, and all sorts of other places from across the country, where they were promised all these jobs, but they were looking for land because land promised wealth, right? Um, when they finally settled and they saw, and others who had come later, so not just in 1891, but they came later because they knew of this Czech community. What they had done was they settled in the community and they named the town Prague, after the city that they had left behind in Europe. The town of Prague still exists, and you can see a picture of it your to the right of the screen. That's actually from the city's homepage, that is still there, and you'll notice um, that the flag in the middle is from the former Czechoslovakia. So it is from their town, and every year they have their parade. You can see a picture of it. So the picture here is, let me see if I can, there you go. So the picture right here is a picture of a parade they hold every year in the town of Prague. So the picture that you're looking at is actually from, I believe, the 1950s early 1950 50s is it's a parade that they hold every year, a festival that they have every year in the town of Prague. But yeah, they are very proud of their heritage. But these are the immigrant communities that are established in Oklahoma Territory, that's indicative of what takes place here, right? And these immigrant communities are key to survival, right? Because without these communities, um, they are there to support each other. They are there to help each other get by. There's Prague. That's how you spell Prague, by the way. Just in case you didn't see it, it's Prague. Okay, that leads me to politics in Oklahoma Territory. So, in terms of politics and political parties, because of the largely white presence in Oklahoma Territory, it's a little bit more contested here. So, um, you have to consider before we get into black homesteaders, you have to consider that you have Kansas to the north and Texas to the south. So Kansas is largely Republican, Texas is largely Democratic, and so there is a little bit of a contest there. And the black homesteaders that are in Oklahoma Territory will provide a little bit more of a balance because black homesteaders are going to vote Republican, right? And again, if you need history on that, refer to your American history textbook on why black homesteaders will vote Republican. They will vote Republican until FDR shows up in the 1930s. So, black homesteaders, roughly 1 out of every 10 voters was black. And again, they are a reliable vote for Republicans. And because you have Oklahoma Territory largely Republican, um, our Oklahoma Territory, even though it's mostly balanced, it will become something that are largely white and with black homesteaders, um, less native populations, or native populations with their own laws and that sort of thing. They are able to establish their own formal territorial government. They establish a territorial government thanks to the Oklahoma Organic Act of 1890. It's a simple structure of government. They have an executive authority with a territorial governor. The territorial governor is assisted by a territorial secretary. Both of these positions are appointed by the President of the United States. So, a governor and a territorial secretary, both appointed by the president. The territory also gets 3 judges, all appointed by the president. They maintain separate territorial courts, but the 3 of them could come together and serve on the territory's Supreme Court. So the territory would have a Supreme Court, but it was made up of the 3 judges who were all appointed by the President of the United States. So the territorial government provided for governments for the counties, the municipalities for rural townships. Um, Local officials were publicly elected. The voters also could select a delegate to Congress. So you didn't have a voting member in Congress, you had a delegate to Congress. The difference is a delegate could speak up on your behalf, but you can't vote on the floor. So that's the real difference. Now, when we talk about the elections that took place in Oklahoma Territory, again, it is contested, but Republicans usually won. The difference, though, is when the populist movement becomes popular, for lack of a better word, this is in the 1890s When the populist movement becomes popular and the Democrats and the populists join forces, they could win elections. So in every election where a representative or a delegate was sent to Congress, um, it was always a Republican. That's the thing. But still, locally, you could get someone who could defeat a Republican. That's the thing. Um, when we talk about the Republican advantage, Oklahoma Territory had more Republican loyalists. And that's because in Oklahoma Territory, thanks to the land runs, thanks to the land lotteries, you had the influence and the influx of Midwestern Midwesterners who wanted to take advantage of the land availability. You had the presence of, all of these immigrants who had shown up. Plus, you had Black homesteaders, and they combined to just over half of the total population. Plus, the other advantage was that you had Republicans in the White House. So, Republicans in the White House were going to do a lot to help um, push for the advantage of Oklahoma Territory. That was something that really um, went to the advantage of Oklahoma Territory. So, with that, you also have the rise of political leaders in Oklahoma Territory. So, George Washington Steele, who is pictured here at the top right, on the far right, was a Union Army veteran and a native of Indiana. He was the first territorial governor. He spent about 15 months in office. He would create the first public school system in the territory. He'll establish 3 colleges, organized a territorial library. He will actually resign as the governor and then be replaced by a couple of guys who, um, you know, will do a few things. The main thing is, though, is that um, he's going to really sort of set the tone for how things go. This next person who is pictured here, the man who's in the darker picture, that's Renfro, William Carey Renfro, was a Democrat, a veteran of the Confederate Army. Um, he will serve for 4 years as governor from 1893 to 1897. Um, During his 4 years, he will open up the Cherokee Outlet to settlement, and you'll remember the Cherokee Outlet is that northern strip of land right on the border of Kansas. Um, he struggles quite a bit with fiscal issues. He's also going to struggle with racial issues, which shouldn't come as a surprise. He's a Democrat and also a veteran of the Confederate Army. The other thing that I want to point out about this is that he is someone who demonstrates early on this tension and this back and forth between Republican control and Democratic control. Now, there are benefits of being a territorial governor, and that is you get to have countless appointments to office. So you can appoint whoever you want to office. And you also have the designation of official printers. So whoever you want to print your stuff, you get to decide who that is. But this is really where things get um, very important in terms of power and influence. And that's when it comes to business in the territory, because these 2 men pictured here are going to be very influential. So in the early 1890s, when you look across the country, you have the emergence of large corporations like General Electric, U.S. Steel, International Harvest, and these large corporations will bring in investments of $1.5 billion, and they'll employ tens of thousands of people, and they'll have mines scattered across the continent, right? But when you look in the territory, there are railroads here, there are utility companies here, there are plenty of other corporations or grazing companies here as well. um And the reason why this matters is because Oklahomans are nervous about this. It makes Oklahomans fearful. But the problem is that Oklahomans can't really do anything about it. And this is, again, while we're in territorial status, there's not a whole lot that Oklahomans can do about this. Um, and this is the thing. You need to be familiar with the Gilded Age to understand why this is significant. So, again, I'm going to refer you to your American history textbook to understand the power structure in the Gilded Age, or during the Gilded Age, because it'll help you better understand why populism matters especially in the American West, and why progressivism will matter. Um, so when we talk about populism is going to be incredibly popular in Oklahoma because populism is a movement that is popular among farmers and workers, um, because it's an attempt to take back power from these large corporations and business owners and put it back in the hands of regular Americans, and hold people accountable with what they are doing with their power, right? Um, but populism fails because they are trying to change things from the top down, right? They are trying to run for the presidency, and not change things um, locally, right there at the in the smallest ways. They're trying to change the big things immediately. Um, and that's where the progressives come in. Um, the progressives sort of take over for the populists and try to do what the populace can't. Um, Progressives presented the opportunity to achieve laws in regulating corporations, protecting the farmers, protecting workers, protecting children, and protecting, the most vulnerable from unfair corporate power. Um, and that's where I want to bring in these two men. So the guy in the cowboy hat with the mustache is William H. Murray. He's also known as Alfalfa Bill. And the other man is Charles N. Haskell. Both of them are known, both of them are businessmen, and they are also going to be very active politically in Oklahoma Territory. Actually, both of them are very active politically in Indian Territory, and are active for a lot of reasons, uh, in in terms of business and in terms of politics. When we talk about these two men in particular, what I want you to understand about them both is that Murray and Haskell are going to have really interesting interpretations of what it means to be progressive, right? Um, when they talk about their own sort of interpretations of progressive politics, um, they will push for the establishment of unions. They will push for workers' rights and farmers' rights and that sort of thing. That's incredibly important to them. However, it is to a limited extent. For example, um, both Murray and Haskell are very familiar with the law. Both of them are lawyers, but both of them are also businessmen. Both of them are married into tribes and so have access to and have taken advantage of, I might add, um, uh, taken advantage of laws that have worked in their favor. And so when we talk about why this is important to them, um, they know and are aware of the struggles that people have had over the years um, with, you know, with having um, or trying to get by. The problem then, of course, though, is that they are also trying to gain influence and power within the territories, and this is their big challenge. Um, and when we talk about progressivism in the territory, it's also going to be a challenge because there is the presence of socialism here. Socialism does make its move into Oklahoma and Indian Territory, which is another reason why you can easily make the argument that Indian Territory is a part of the American West. When populism makes its way over here, so does socialism, and farmers and workers here find socialism really appealing, and it is something that we'll talk about further as we go along in the narrative. So I want to talk about how the um, shift takes place in setting up statehood. The focus that I want to shift to now, though, is how we get from twin territories to statehood. And I want to shift gears towards um, native lands and how those are broken up further and opened up towards white settlement. So that all starts with legislation, specifically with starting with the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. So the Dawes Allotment Act begins with complaints, naturally. The Dawes Allotment Act in the late 1880s begins when people start demanding drastic change. For native tribes who complain that when people complain that these native tribes are living on all of this land and aren't using all of that land. The complaint was you have these tribes who are of small population size and are on massive tracts of land. And so the Dawes Allotment Act basically divides the land up into 160 acres, essentially individual plots of land for individual native peoples. Okay. So it divides native lands, it divides these reservations into individual plots of land. And it's not just the lands that's dividing up, it's dividing up the resources on the lands. So the lands are divided up as are the resources. And the lands are divided up into 160 acres. So 160 acres should sound familiar to you because that's what the Homestead Act is divided up into, right? So when we talk about the Dawes Act, here's what I want you to keep in mind: it applies to every tribe except the five southeastern tribes. It applies to every tribe except the five southeastern tribes. So, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind, and in your notes, underline this, is that there are a lot of white Americans who are going to complain about that and say, why are the five Southeastern tribes getting special treatment? It's time for them to be fully assimilated. And the counter argument to that is, well, the five Southeastern tribes have a long history with the federal government. They have a special relationship here. They've maintained their own territory. They've assimilated in a lot of other ways. Plus, they've had a lot of other issues. So essentially, they avoid the Dawes Allotment Act. Here's the other thing that I want you to keep in mind, and that is, okay, if the Dawes Allotment Act is dividing the reservations into 160 acres, um, then what? Well, what ends up happening is, because these tribes are relatively small populations and these reservations are huge amounts of land, what ends up happening is there's a lot of extra land, or what's known as surplus land. The surplus land will then become U.S. public lands. And because they are public lands, they are subject to the Homestead Act. And because they are subject to the Homestead Act, they are now available for settlement. That's what opens it up to white settlement. And the thing is, the reason why people are going to complain about the five Southeastern tribes is because they want to settle on their land. And it's a tremendous amount of land. Remember, we are talking about the entire eastern half of present day Oklahoma, right? And that's going to be resource rich. Remember, I mean, when we are talking about all of that area, that's where J.J. McAllister makes most of his coal wealth. So this is where uh, you have the government starting to rethink things. And Henry Dawes, Dawes, who was the author of the Dawes Allotment Act, Henry Dawes will head a special commission to negotiate with the five tribes. And the Dawes Commission will last for 3 years. This is 1893. He will head this commission to negotiate for 3 years, and eventually, what you will have is the Curtis Act. The Curtis Act of 1898 will essentially um, provide a new dividing process. Charles Curtis, who is pictured there, Charles Curtis is a representative from Kansas, a congressman from Kansas, who was a mixed blood Native American, by the way, a mixed blood Kaw. Um, and this law established a harsh process for dividing tribal lands. But it doesn't just divide up tribal lands. It does much, much more. And this is where you need to probably pause this recording so that you can make sure that you are able to write everything down. So it will divide tribal lands, just like the Dawes Allotment Act does, but it also abolishes tribal governments without their consent. Now, the terms of the Curtis Act would be suspended if, and only if, the tribes agreed to divide their property and end their governments by other methods. In other words, if the tribes agreed to divide their lands and still end their governments on their own terms, then it doesn't have to happen forcefully. It doesn't have to happen the way that the Curtis Act does. But essentially, they're giving up tribal sovereignty, because the Curtis Act will also end tribal courts and any other form of tribal governments once allotment had been completed. Okay. So the question then becomes, we've gone through the Dodgers Commission. The question then becomes, okay, how do we divide the land? How do we figure out what to work through? Well, this is where things get complicated because most of these tribes really divided up the land based on what kind of citizen the person was. And by that, I mean, was this person a full blooded citizen? Were they a mixed blood citizen? Or were they an intermarried white person? And for them, homestead was usually defined as 40 acres. Um, a surplus was additional land given to each person. Um, all land was given to tribal citizens. Uh, no land was given to anyone else. So if you wanted to buy land, that's just too bad, so sad. You can't just um, have the land for the sake of having the land. You can't work your way into it. Um, you had to be a tribal citizen somehow, some way. But it is all sort of dependent on what was available. Here's the thing: when we talk about how much land is available, there are 19.53 million acres of land that was surveyed and appraised. 497 acres had been set aside for railroads, town sites, churches, schools, cemeteries, and that sort of thing. Um, so you've got to figure out, okay, well, you've got all of these restrictions, right? Um, and then also got to realize that not everybody is accepting of of these of these issues. Let me go back to restrictions for a second. There are restrictions on the the allotments too, because there are people who wanted to sell their allotments, but that was forbidden, um, primarily because because the commission knew that there would be white settlers who would want to try and take advantage of native peoples, um, and try to buy their way into the area. And so the commission said, absolutely not. You could not sell your allotment, and this was designed to protect Indians from losing their allotments outright. There were restrictions dependent on, of course, your blood quantum. Right, the idea was mixed blood versus full blood. Most restricted allotments went to full bloods for 25 years. In other words, you had to essentially live on the land or own the land for 25 years. Um, what you have to keep in mind here, though, is that no matter what, the tribes were losing sovereignty. Um, Newcomers were getting the benefit of their rights. The businesses were they were seeing this as opportunities for business. Economic progress took precedent over priority, right? That was took the priority over everything else. Um, and of course, there is resistance to this, right? Nobody among the traditional full-blooded native peoples want to participate in anything like this, particularly um, uh, you know those who are subscribed to this traditional way of thinking. Like, for example, um, though there are those who still refuse to learn the English language. There were those who lived far from the new towns and cities. There were those who hid from government census takers. There were those who hid from, or who refused to go to land offices so they could find out what their land allotments were. The allotments were essentially just assigned to them, and they were informed by mail. They wanted no part of it. Um, there was something established known as the Four Mothers Society. The Four Mothers Society was active in every tribe except for the Seminole tribe. The Four Mother Society had 24,000 members, and it was essentially an organization designed to fight back against this commission and fight for tribal identity and fight for tribal sovereignty and that sort of thing. Um, but of course, like the perfect example of resistance would come from Chido Harjo. Chido Harjo was full blooded Creek, and he would lead what was known as the Crazy Snake Rebellion. He organized a shadow government with a council and established laws, and it forbade fellow Creeks from accepting allotments, from renting lands to non Creeks, from employing white labor, from basically accepting anything that the commission had established in line with the allotment laws. He even established a form of law enforcement where if you broke any of these laws, you were arrested and then you were whipped. So Harjo and his men were, essentially um, really reinforcing this idea that we are going to resist with everything that we have, right? Um, but the problem with this is, um, at this point, there are so many people who are finding ways to get around allotment, or get around the rules and the laws, that it was just it was really tragic. There was this process, or there were these loopholes known as grafting that would take advantage of the most disadvantaged people in the native populations. Um, Restrictions in the allotment restrictions were so complicated that it really opened the door for people who were looking to take advantage to gain lands and gain access to resources. And those people were known as grafters. Um, so here's the thing: these restrictions are really complicated, and if you're not educated, or if you don't know the language, or if you're illiterate, you would need help, right? If you would need help to understand what these restrictions were, or how to get, how to work with them. And so, like, what could be sold, when could you sell them, who could you sell them to, how could you sell them, when, all of that stuff. So someone would inevitably show up to quote unquote help, and inevitably those helpers would screw you out of land and money. And of course, that person would be involved at every point in the allotment process and find a way to, you know, designate themselves as um, as the person able to take the title to the land. So here's what would end up happening: they would find the Native American. They would complete the forms on behalf of that person. So let's say this person is a member of the Seminole tribe. So the grafter would find the Seminole woman, complete the government forms, identify what land that person wanted as a homestead or surplus, um, and then go from there. Um, you know, restricted land um, allotments, before we get into the most common victims, one of the things that you should understand is restricted land allotments could not be sold for a certain time, but they could be leased, right? So leases were usually signed immediately after allotments were assigned. So some of these leases were could go for as long as 99 years, and you would sign these leases for $10 a year or $15 a year. One group in the Creek Nation managed to gain control of more than 80,000 acres of allotted lands. 80,000 acres of allotted lands for somewhere around $10 to $15 a year. That's how they grafted their way into these land allotments. When we talk about the most common victims, it's usually children. Children were tribal citizens, obviously, um, but children shared in the allotments with adults. And if you were a grafter, um, you wanted full blooded orphaned children because they were the most vulnerable, because they didn't have parents, they didn't have family. Control of the land was given to a child's guardian. Um, if you were a grafter and a child's guardian, you controlled their birthright. And there were some grafters who controlled the birthrights of hundreds of children. And what they would do is they would lease out the land of all of these, all of these lands, all of these birthrights, and get all of the profits. And the children wouldn't see any of that profit. And what would be really bad is that these children would never be taken care of. This gets really bad, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture. But many of these children would be abandoned, and these grafters would make literally thousands upon thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, because of their access to the birthright, to these lands, to these resources that they'd have. The other most common victim, of course, were the elderly. Um, so restrictions, of course, forbade the sale of land, but the land could be willed to someone. So in other words, you could inherit the land upon a person's death. So grafters would look for the very sick or the very old. And for very little cash, Native people would sign wills, or death claims. And you didn't even have to be literate. All you would have to do is mark it with an X and sign your allotment over to so and so. And they would promise to pay you for medical treatment or pay your whatever, and to, help you through your last days or make it easier for you. And as soon as you died, um, somebody else gets control of all of your land and your resources. They'd lease out your land. They controlled all of your stuff, and they'd make money off of it. In 1906, at least 2,300 death claims were put in place. Um, there were special laws enacted to lift restrictions so a person could sell the land. Some petitioners wanted to make money, but others would unknowingly sign papers in a language they didn't understand to petition Congress to lift restrictions, um, because grafters would lie to them. They would con them. They would con these poor people. So when restrictions expired, grafters, of course, planned on selling the land. Um, so for the creeks, for example, um, in August of 1907, their restrictions expired at 12:01 a.m. Um, Creeks lived in the eastern half of Oklahoma around Muskogee. So this was August 8th, 1907. Let me see if I have this here. Yeah. August 8th, 1907, uh, the restrictions expired at 12:01 a.m. And the day before, and even into that evening, mixed bloods and freed persons came into Muskogee on trains that had been chartered by local grafters. And there were 437,790 acres. Half of the 437,790 acres were sold in just 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Um, when we talk about the end of Indian Territory, nothing really explains or describes the end of Indian Territory better than this story. Pictured here is Chitto Harjo, the same Chitto Harjo who led the Crazy Snake Rebellion. Chitto Harjo went to the U.S. Capitol carrying a copy of the treaty that the federal government had made with his Creek ancestors. And of course, at this time, Teddy Roosevelt was president of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt, who famously attended uh, conferences known as Friend of the Indian and that sort of thing. Um, Harjo went to the Capitol and went to Washington to meet with Roosevelt and ask him if the treaty's promises of a permanent Creek nation in a permanent Indian territory were invalid. And Roosevelt saw him, shook his hand, and then walked away and never spoke a word, never heard what Harjo had to say. And that was it. That was the end of the meeting. There was no conversation. There was no opportunity for Harjo to make his case. Nothing. And meanwhile, you can see how Indian Territory is presented for white settlement and how it's just opened for everyone else on the right-hand side here, right? You have all of these people who had been promised Indian Territory, permanent Indian Territory and permanent Creek Nation, the so-called permanence of Indian sovereignty. And that was never meant to be.